Thank you for asking me to be here today, Maria. I will start this with I am no expert as regards to mycoplasma status at the boar stud, but this is what happens when you ask the question. You get volunteered to do the work associated with it. So before I really talk about mycoplasma as it relates to boar studs, I just kind of want to give you guys a background of the Maschhoff approach and what we've done for mycoplasma within our system to kind of get to how we ask the question about what do we need to think about mycoplasma as it regards to our boar studs. So our system prior to 2015 would have been endemic for mycoplasma in both our internal genetic operations and within our commercial system, and we tried that sledgehammer approach of utilize antibiotics, try to control it with gilt acclimation, and we just didn't determine that that worked for us. So we started at the top down from a genetic animal level, unwinded our nucleus, and eliminated in our genetic herds. And so from that, we did some value assessment. Dr. Yeske came in and gave us some ideas of how to go about this within our system, and really took a multi-phase approach from the top down. From that, then we started sourcing our commercial herds with negative gilts, so we had to think about how are we going to really look at gilt acclimation and how are we going to eliminate in conjunction with that in our commercial herds. From that, we've learned a lot about exposure and control strategies within our system, and we've started asking ourselves how do we look at our health assurance now that we do it. So very similar to what Laura talked about earlier, how do you look at testing, what's your strategy going to be for that? To date, we've had success in a lot of our herds. Nearly all of our breed-to-wean herds within our system are mycoplasma negative, and we hope by 2020 that we're only running one positive control herd just for the special situation of where that herd is located and where it's at. We've had good results in it. We've had improved grade A feeder to market, reduction in finishing mortality. That's one of the fun metrics to look at every week on our system reports. And we've had substantial vet med savings in regards to the results we've had from the efforts on mycoplasma elimination. I'll really start with that we've had some lessons learned in the process. We've had 2 of our breed-to-wean herds that I'll call a re-break or an unsuccessful closure. We've learned that we used various antibiotic protocols in our closure, and maybe we've got some lessons learned of timing and drugs that we're going to use in that process, as well as a lot about how do we establish that day 0 prior to closure, especially when you're looking at that in association with gilts. We've asked ourselves questions about health assurance testing of now that you have a negative herd, what is your testing strategy going to be for gilts prior to entering your sow herds? And because we have internal proprietary genetic lines, we've worked towards what does that pre-shipment gilt testing look like, and have voted for deep tracheal swabs in that process. And so because of that, we've continued to ask ourselves questions of what else do we need to know, because we're really at the beginning of what does it mean to have mycoplasma negative animals within our system. And so one of those questions was, what is the risk potential of myco transmission from boar studs? Is transmission in semen even possible? I would tell you when I reached out to those experts that I knew that were working with boar studs, their instant answer was no. And I'm still young enough to say I don't know that I believe you every time you automatically say no, because I don't want to make those mistakes. And then how do we, with that, weigh the risk of what mycoplasma transmission from boar studs would be? Where does the boar stud sit in the health pyramid? At the top. And what would that impact be for our system specifically if the boar stud could transmit mycoplasma to the rest of our system? And so just kind of had a graph here to say it's the top of the pyramid. It's probably something we should absolutely look at, because if we look at our system and the investments we've made for all the sows in our breed-to-wean units, we probably need to look at the investment of something that's going to impact multiple sow farms. With that, I would say that I didn't do all the work on the literature review. That's the one good thing about having interns every summer. And so we kind of looked at what's the epidemiology of mycoplasma. We've got well-documented information about nose-to-nose contact. A lot of us talk about airborne transmission and homogeneous exposure to animals, but what about the systemic possibilities? So it was nice to have Deb in here right before me to talk about mycoplasma and processing fluids, because there are some studies out there there that indicate there is systemic possibilities with Mycoplasma pneumoniae. As well as with the histology, there is ciliated epithelium in both the respiratory and reproductive tract. So it's not completely out of the question to ask, is that transmission possible? So what did our system decide to do? We decided that within our stud specifically, we wanted to do some of that due diligence and do a risk assessment. I'll backtrack with a little bit of history so you can see why we wanted to do the risk assessments that I'll talk about from our boar studs. In 2015, our system was positive. We did elimination projects at our nucleus and multiplier herds, but at the same time that we did those projects in the herds, we did not look at any control or elimination methods within the boar studs. So we would have been sourcing from positive animals, then thus into negative animals into our boar stud starting in 2015. In 2018, one of our herds that was still supplying our boar studs never actually went through a myco-elimination. They were a herd that hadn't broke with PRRS, but unfortunately in 2018 they did. So within the last year, as of this spring, the last source boar supply herd into our stud has eliminated Mycoplasma. Moving forward, I'm going to talk about two surveillance projects. So this is the first one that we've done. At one of our boar studs, it's a 300 head stud, has 4 individual rooms with a center office, has a separated isolation and a detached lab. And we collected these samples over a 2-week time frame. This, keep in mind, is a very generalized assessment. We did not randomly select the boars within the stud, age, location within the stud, any of those things for this surveillance project. I know when Maria and I were talking about it, there's a perfect way to design it, and then there's a way the boar stud production team will let you do a study like this. So it was really of, let's just do what boars are currently being selected based on index over the next couple weeks and use those animals for just this general surveillance. For this study, we took the gel fraction of the semen. So in the collection process, we took the portion of the semen that the stud was going to discard anyway, not the actual semen that would have been sent to the lab. Typically, that little first bit, they'll just discard and put away. So all we did was save that, transfer it into a falcon tube, and send that off for PCR testing. We sent in over 250 samples, but of those samples that we sent in, only 250 of them have enough quantity to be tested, and all 250 of those samples were negative via PCR for Mycoplasma. The second surveillance project, and I can't take all the credit for the physical labor to do this because we actually put an intern at doing this project this summer, which was very interesting to do some of the things we did in association with boars at our studs. We had 2 boar studs involved this time. The first one was the same as I previously described. At that stud, we sampled 60 of the boars, so 60 of the 300 that I mentioned. 58% of those 60 boars we sampled were from that source herd that had just eliminated Mycoplasma in 2019. The second boar stud is a 190 head stud. It has a separated isolation, but it only has a hallway separating its lab. At that stud, we sampled only 30 boars, and 33% of the boars that we did sample were from the herd that eliminated Mycoplasma in 2019. For the collection, it was either a 1 to 2 day process, and I didn't send the charts up here for you, but we did have a pretty good representation of the rooms within the stud, the alleys within the stud, and a good separation of boars and where they're generally housed in that process. For this surveillance project, we actually took 4 sample types. We took a tracheal bronchial swab. In our system, when we take a deep tracheal swab, we use the inner catheter of a PCI rod, and we insert a flock swab on the end of it. And then we took foamy saliva, or what we would have called those frothy oral fluids. So while the boar was standing in the holding area, or while he was on the dummy, when he just has the foam around his mouth, we swabbed that. Prior to swabbing, we would have dipped the 4x4 gob square on the end of the rubber piece of a PCI rod into PBS solution, just so we could get enough of that solution into a sample for quantity. And then we collected semen. This time when we collected semen, it was collected directly at the lab right prior to extension. And we also collected serum at the same time within the surveillance project. Based on that, all of the PCRs that we sent off for tracheobronchial swabs, semen, and the frothy saliva on the boars was negative. We did get negative, positive, and suspect results. Keep in mind when you're looking at this chart that we sampled 60 boars at stud 1, which is the stud in green, and we collected 30 at stud 2. So even though the numbers look a little different, the quantity of animals, because this is just the total number of each of those within the sample set. From the ELISA results, this is stud 1, so on your x-axis here is going to be the age of the boar in months, and your SP values are going to be on your y-axis. And as you can see, there's a generalized trend of the ELISAs decreasing at the stud. There were a few boars here and there at both of the studs that had ELISA results that were a little higher than we would have expected. But in general, there's a declining trend that as the boar ages, his ELISA results are decreasing. Results are very similar for stud 2, and keep in mind there's just a difference in the number of spots based on the number of boars we collected at this stud as well. So from that, a couple comments I will make is most of the results were as anticipated based on those experts' opinions in regards to boar studs. The ELISA results for us were not surprising due to our vaccination strategy. So even though our source farms, except for that one up until this point, would have sourced from Mycoplasma negative herds, we do vaccinate our boars in isolation with a Mycoplasma vaccine. So those results weren't necessarily surprising to us, except for those few that had those SP values that were a little higher. And for us, how do you know if that's vaccine or exposure? That was still a question at the end of these surveillance projects. And then honestly, I expected to have a few PCR positives on the tracheobronchial swabs on some of the younger boars that were in the stud, just based on their age, and that we knew they were sourced from a positive herd prior to that, where we had actually done tracheal swabs at that source farm beforehand. So I was just a little surprised that some of those younger birds weren't positive. Final thoughts on it is that transmission may be unlikely between boar studs and breeding herds and might be a low risk. But I don't know that these are enough to tell us that, but it's enough to at least continue to help us ask the questions and have some encouraging results to start with. And so other questions that we've asked after this surveillance is, does it matter if we eliminate Mycoplasma or have negative studs? What risk profile are we willing to take within our system and our studs and our herds? And if we decide to take our studs negative or try to eliminate there, what's our monitoring program going to be like? As we've discussed within our system, we would love to get to the point that we can use serum and not a tracheobronchial swab. I would tell you it is not the most fun thing to get a snare around a boar's mouth and get him ready to go. It's doable, but I don't hope that that's the sample of choice that we have to use at a boar stud. I would challenge those that are managing boar studs to do the due diligence that we did and share that information, because I think there's more to learn as we have more and more people within the industry that are eliminating Mycoplasma within their breeding herds. And I think one of my favorite quotes in the last couple months as we worked with Mycoplasma is, we reserve the right to get smarter, and so we just wanted to share this information of what we found in our boar studs and continue to learn from this point on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maschhoff. So I've heard before, expect to be disappointed when you work with Michael. So this is a little bit similar in that sense. Very interesting indeed. What would be your thoughts on, like all the dynamics in a boar stud, which is so different? We cannot compare exactly, with a sow herd. Replacement rate, facilities, all that. So do you think that can play a role in the transmission of myco, in the sense that you think, well, these boars are being supplied by a farm that is myco positive, how come that we are not getting it, detecting it there? So could it be that the way in which the boar stud is managed, then it's one of those things that is driving that negativity that you're seeing in those samples?
Sure. I would tell you that I think that makes a big difference in how we would look at Mycoplasma control at a boar stud level. So obviously boar studs have a really high replacement rate. We like to turn animals over quickly. For this herd in particular, the source farm that was still positive was an internally replaced herd. So they probably were actually pretty stable for Mycoplasma to begin with prior to, even though they were positive. And then our boar studs run a high replacement rate. So we're constantly putting new animals in and getting animals out, so I think that would impact the shedding dynamic at the same time.